Welcome you guys to exploring Apple's Human Interface Guidelines. I'll start with a quick review of the history of human interface thinking, then I'll touch on the idea of user-centered design, and finally I'll get into Apple's guidelines. First some principles, then a bunch of more specific guidelines grouped into various topics. I do have a caveat. Apple's guidelines are intended for people developing applications for iOS and Mac OS X, not for FileMaker developers. So I've put a great deal of work into selecting guidelines that are relevant to us. I've also added material from other sources when it helps to explain the guidelines, and when there are important recommendations from FileMaker on the same theme, threw them in as well. So it means we got a lot to cover. In 1983, Donald Moorman published design rules based on human cognition. 5 years later, he published his classic, The Design of Everyday Things. Here's a great quote from that. Design is really an act of communication, which means having a deep understanding of the person with whom the designer is communicating. In 1984, the first Mac was released. With its graphical interface and direct manipulation, the Mac raised the bar on the user experience. In 1986, the Apple Human Interface Group was founded. This is a key moment. This group was unusual for taking an interdisciplinary approach involving psychologists and sociologists, videographers, and animators. It was an amazing time. The group advocated requirements gathering, prototyping, evaluation by users, lots of things that we now take for granted. They crafted a consistent design methodology based around clear, real-world images and metaphors. In 1987, the group published the Macintosh Human Interface Guidelines, which have set the course for the evolution of the Mac OS ever since. Originally, it was a big old printed book, but now the guidelines are available for free as a PDF. It's interesting to see how much Apple got right from the start, and how consistent their approach has remained over the years. Many of the principles that appeared in the first guidelines are still in the guidelines today. Then in the 90s, there was an explosion of the internet and web. Initially, this took design back about 10 years, because the tools were so limited, but web pages got the attention of CEOs and business managers. Suddenly, design was on everyone's mind. More recently, the release of the iPhone and the rise of mobile devices with their tiny little screens has encouraged simplicity. Consider Luke Wroblewski's recommendation to design for mobile first, before designing for the desktop. He said, losing 80% of your screen space forces you to focus. You need to know what matters most. To do that, you need to know your customers and business, which is good design 101. Design for mobile first. Then in 2013, the release of iOS 7 acknowledged a change in Apple's design approach. A long-standing tradition of skeuomorphism, an attempt to represent real-world objects on the computer, gave way to a less literal approach and a flat look. I'll talk about this some more later. Johnny Ive says, people had already become comfortable with touching glass. They didn't need physical buttons. There was an incredible liberty in not having to reference the physical world so literally. And that brings us to today at Apple's design guidelines. It's worth looking at Apple's guidelines specifically because Apple sets the standard. I think they've got the best interface group in the world. And as well, FileMaker is an Apple product, and the most recent versions of FileMaker have been strongly influenced by Apple's guidelines. Approach the guidelines as a set of principles rather than a reliable recipe. Just as your goals may conflict, the principles themselves are sometimes in tension with each other. It's up to you to find the balance. I'm going to talk about 12 principles first, then later 12 groups of guidelines. I've grouped the principles as follows. Don't worry about the sub-bullets, you're going to see these over and over again. Make it easy. Encourage exploration. Manage perceptions. And go mobile. Here we go. Principles group 1. Make it easy. The principle of familiarity. When something is familiar, the user can guess its purpose and how to use it. When many designers take a similar approach to a specific design problem, we call that a design pattern. By following patterns that the user recognizes, you allow them to transfer their knowledge and skills to your solution. Last year, Don Levan gave a great talk on navigation and interface patterns. If you have access to the video, I recommend checking it out. Here's an example of the 3-panel selector interface pattern in Apple Mail. You can see that on the left, and I hope that you can see, yes, great. You can see on the left, you have mailboxes, basically groups of messages. In the middle, you have a list of the messages in a given mailbox. And on the right, you have the detail for the message that is currently selected in the list. That's a classic interface pattern. Let's see it applied in FileMaker. Here's a personal solution I created for organizing all the Latin American songs I've transcribed and recorded. On the left are groupings of songs, here by country. In the middle, we see a list of the songs for the currently selected country, and on the right, the score for the currently selected song appears. Exactly the same pattern. So go ahead and copy patterns like that one from Mail or Finder or Pages, whatever tools your users know best. The idea is to follow the user's established way of working if possible, to know what the user expects and let this guide your design. And be sure to consider how people learn. Performing learned actions is easy. Performing new actions is more challenging, but changing learned ones, that's where it gets really hard. So don't make your user unlearn what they already know, unless what you propose is so much better that they agree it's worth the effort. The principle of consistency. Don't make me think. Your solution should be consistent with user expectations, with external standards, if you're making a suite of solutions, with that suite, within the solution itself for sure, and with earlier versions of the solution. Note that the point is not to be mindlessly consistent in every possible way. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds and obsessive-compulsive developers. But then there's the other extreme, the burning need to be original and to put your stamp on everything. Which brings me to the principle of simplicity. Less is more. This quote from Johnny Ive illustrates what Apple has in mind here. Simplicity is not the absence of clutter. That's a consequence of simplicity. It's an approach and a philosophy about authenticity and being honest. Simplicity is essentially describing the purpose and place of an object and product. So stay focused on the goals of the solution, that is, the goals of the user. Deliver only what the user needs and nothing more. Instead of confronting users with many options, give them 3 or 4 options, leading to another choice of 3 or 4, and so on. People do better generally with extra clicks than with having to process too many choices at once. And strip out the chart junk from your layouts. The extraneous visual elements, borders, backgrounds, decorations that distract from the content. So that was group 1, make it easy. Things that help to make your solution intuitive and easy to use. Here's group 2, encourage exploration. The principle of availability. The most needed feature at any given moment should be readily at hand. Make all major features easy to access, at least when they're needed. The user shouldn't have to dig for them. It can be challenging to reconcile this with simplicity. Of course, if you try to make absolutely everything available, always it won't be available. You'll have TLC, total layout chaos. For example, please reconsider those enormous, comprehensive, super-duper user layouts. If someone else needs to take that super user's place, they will weep bitter tears. The principle of discoverability. If the user can't find it, it doesn't really exist. Many people learn best by exploring software and trying things out. So provide visual cues about the purpose of each interface element. Use tooltips liberally with the awareness that they're not supported in iOS, and don't neglect documentation, which can be a godsend for a motivated user. Sarah Severson recommends making use of requirements documents as a basis for this. The challenge, of course, is keeping the documentation current, or doing it at all. And the principle of forgiveness. The user should not be able to do anything wrong. That's an ideal, but if they're not afraid of making mistakes, they're more likely to explore and discover features. And if they can't do anything wrong, they'll need less support as well. So anticipate common problems by implementing user-friendly error trapping and thoughtful workflow. Warn users about irrecoverable actions and any potential side effects if they choose to continue. Everyone expects undo these days, and it's not so easy to implement in FileMaker, but you do have some options. Check out Todd Geist's work on transaction management, making data changes through relationships and the explicit use of the commit record and revert record commands. This can give you full data rollback support, i.e. undo. And if that's too ambitious, how about something like this? When importing data, rather than bringing it directly into an important table, consider importing it to a temporary table first, allowing the user to review it, mark it up, and decide what data to import. So that was group 2, encourage exploration, the main goal here being to empower the user. Here's group 3, manage perceptions. The principle of perceived stability. Earn the user's trust. The emphasis here is on perception. Your solution appears to be stable. Your solution appears to be trustworthy, and you accomplish that through communication. Communicate feedback for every action or process. This will keep coming up, so I'll talk about it some more later. And this may be obvious, but don't lose data by deleting or overwriting records. Learn about strategies for handling record locking and employ them. Preserve found sets with tender care, because the disruption of found sets or the omission of records can cause the user to think those records have been deleted. Finally, if an automatic process changes data in key search fields, like status, for example, be sure that the user expects this or is informed about it in some way. The principle of aesthetic integrity, it just feels right. The interface will feel right when it reflects the user's conception of the task at hand. That is, the appearance and behavior of the solution integrate with its function to send a coherent and easily understood message to the user. If you send mixed signals by presenting an interface that's intrusive, frivolous, or arbitrary, your users might question the solution's reliability or trustworthiness. Consider how you name your solution, the logos or icons you design for it, even the color palette you employ. All of these should send a clear, unified message about the solution's purpose and identity. Unconventional choices are a gamble. Be conscious of your intended audience and your intentions. And the principle of discernment. Know when it's time to let go. I confess I made this one up, but bear with me. This is about knowing what's too developer-centered and what just doesn't work when you've gotten wrapped up in your own perceived brilliance. When you're trying to recreate other interfaces and user experiences, and you should, but you try to do something like using the new slide panel control to give a feeling of sliding layers. If it doesn't quite feel like the original experience, you've entered the uncanny valley, where the not quite rightness of the experience makes the user uncomfortable and distrustful. Let me show you what I mean. I have a video here of the Mail app on the iPhone. I assume you've all used the Mail app, but I want to examine it more closely. We're going to watch me swipe a message in list view. I want you to pay attention to the animation specifically. Here we go. I'm waiting for the finger. Oh, I have to watch that. Okay, swiping, and it bounced a little bit. Did you see that? And then the options come up from the bottom with cancel anchored at the bottom, and they go away the same way, and then they swipe back into position. Notice how when the email summary slides off to the left, the content is cropped from the left. You just see the right-hand portion of the text. Let's watch it one more time with a focus on that. Come on, finger. There we go. Swipe. See, you just see the right-hand portion of the text. It's just slid away enough to hide the rest of it. And then the options come up with cancel on the bottom, they go away, and so on. That was mail. Here's the personal solution for music that I showed you before. This is a list layout for FileMaker Go. I created it for demonstration purposes with the intention of recreating the functionality of a mail app, more or less. I'm not sure I would do this otherwise. Let's see how it behaves. Here comes the finger. It's a different animation. And look, there's a popover above the data row. And in that popover, let's see, we see the same animation go. It's like you've got a whole panel there sliding all the way over and a new panel coming, right? Panel 1, panel 2. Either change the feature so much that it feels like its own experience, or have the discernment to know you haven't succeeded, and cut it, even if it was a labor of love. So that was group 3, manage perceptions. Keep imagining what sort of impression your solution is going to make on the user and why. Here's group 4, go mobile. These are new ideas specific to iOS. They're relevant to the desktop as well. The principle of deference. The interface never competes with the content. You want to give the content center stage, minimize margins, borders, and lines, substituting organization, alignment, grouping, and structure. Here we're looking at the calculator app. Both versions of the calculator basically have the same amount of empty space, but the new version is easier for the eye to process. The numbers are bigger, and the space between the buttons has been removed. The calculated amount is easier to read against a black background rather than that sort of dirty beige gradient, and the shiny button gradients are gone as well. I believe the technical term is lickable. Take the content to the edge of the screen. Full screen windows can help users to focus. I realize that FileMaker Go has some Chrome built in, but use all the real estate available to you. In weather, you can see that the temperature has been made much bigger and is placed centrally with lots of open space. It gets the focus, not the sun. There aren't as many horizontal lines, just 3 of them to divide distinct areas of the content, and the background image fills all available space with no margin, giving a wonderful feeling of open sky. Reconsider bezels, gradients, and drop shadows, all those heavy treatments that call attention to themselves. And try borderless buttons as well. That was the principle of deference. And who knows, maybe adopting some of these recommendations could help you find an incredible liberty in not having to reference the physical world so literally. The principle of clarity. Give focus to the most important content and functionality. When you discover a good structure for the information you want to present, the interface practically simplifies itself. You need fewer words and explanations, and the eye immediately is drawn to what's most important. Be aware of the space not occupied by your content. Large amounts of negative space make important content and functionality stand out. It can also provide a feeling of calm and focus. You can use color to simplify the interface as well. You just saw an example of how if you use color to signify interaction, you won't need button borders or gradients. Likewise, if you use color to indicate required fields, you might not need a label saying required. A consistent color for errors might allow you to shorten your error messages, and you can use brand colors to represent your brand, only placing your logo on the initial screen that the user sees. Whatever meanings or signals you associate with color, be sure to do so consistently. And the principle of depth. Layers convey hierarchy, position, and relationship. Apple says, visual layers and realistic motion impart vitality and heighten users' delight and understanding. iOS 7 and FileMaker 13 provide some cool new metaphors for us. We have translucent objects showing what's behind them, layers that slide to reveal new content beneath them, popovers that appear on top of the main content. All of this means that we are entering the 3rd dimension. I think that we're seeing a trend towards flatness due to these new layers in iOS, because we don't want 3D objects on individual layers to interfere with the cumulative sense of depth coming from the layers stacked on top of each other. If we could just reach into the iPhone like it was a holographic box and manipulate the stuff inside, then 3D images might work better. But since we're really working with a 2D perfect surface of glass, it makes sense for each layer to have the same flat quality. So that was Go Mobile. These ideas come from the iOS team, so they overlap a little with the other principles. There's 2, just to be clear, there's an iOS guidelines and a Mac OS X guidelines, and I'm kind of mashing them together. But they give you an idea of where Apple's design vision is going, because I think that iOS is the harbinger of Apple's design intentions. So that's the end of the 12 principles. I hope you found them useful.